The book of Joseph of Egypt? Seriously? Yeah, there is a book of Joseph of Egypt. There is and was a book of Joseph of Egypt. Was it translated? If so, do we have that? Do we have references from individuals that talked about the book of Joseph? Were there facsimiles in the book of Joseph and the scrolls, just like there were with the book of Abraham and its scrolls, its papyrus? Yes. Do we have them? Yes. In this interview with Bruce Porter, we're going to pull back the veil and go over the book of Joseph. Now, of course, this episode is brought to you by the Gospel on the Nile cruise coming September 10th through 19th this year, 2024. We're going to go to the exact lot or plot where the mummies and the papyri were found and then eventually ended up in Joseph Smith's hands. We're going to go to the Temple of Luxor. We're going to go to the Temple of Karnak and many other of the magnificent ruins that you find in Egypt. Outside of the temple itself, you'll learn more about the temple and your experience there in Egypt than anywhere else. Go to cwicmedia.com, that's CWICmedia.com. Go to trips and events at the top. Scroll down to Gospel on the Nile. I would love to see you there. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we bring back Bruce Porter, who is going to help us unveil the very elusive book of Joseph. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Greg. It's good to be back. It's good to be back.
Well, this is really an interesting subject because it's rarely ever mentioned. I think that a lot of members of the church are even in a, they may not even know about this. They may have never even heard about it. And those that may have heard about it, it might be like, well, is this just legend? Is this a myth about the book of Joseph? Can you start off talking about the origins of this? Where do we get this? Is there really a book of Joseph? And then, which there is, and we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of what is actually known about the book of Joseph.
Well, the origin, it begins in Egypt in a place called Abu al-Ghorna, which is in Thebes. Labolo Antonio Labolo, I guess, if you want to call it that or how you pronounce it, digs up the mummies. He takes them to Italy, where they are then put on consignment in Trieste. After Labolo's death, the executor of the estate sends him to his son, Labolo's nephew, who is, his name is Bertola, who is a veterinarian in Philadelphia or New York, I believe Philadelphia, who then ends up selling them to Chandler through a law firm, who lends or gives the mummies to Chandler with a promise of payment. And Chandler goes about on the East Coast, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, then over to Harrisburg, Cleveland, and then to Kirtland. And on the way, he's dropping mummies. There's been a couple of mummies there in Philadelphia. There's, I believe, two of them went to the Academy of Science in Philadelphia. One of them went to the, it looks like one of them went to the Masonic Hall in Philadelphia. Does the same in Baltimore. By the time he gets to Harrisburg, he's got 6. The winter of 1834-35, he's got 6 in Harrisburg. And then he goes to Cleveland early that spring, and then of 35. And then by July 3rd of 35, he comes into Kirtland. He's only got 4 of them.
Okay, and these are the mummies, and there's papyri along with these that include the book of Joseph or whatever triggers the book of Joseph, if you will, along with the papyri and the facsimiles of the book of Abraham, correct?
Exactly. Joseph said when he reviewed the papyrus between the 3rd and 6th of July in 1835, he said this would lead to the book of Joseph, that this collection that Chandler had for sale for $2,400 would lead to the book of Joseph and the book of Abraham. And so they were purchased in shortly after July 6th of 35. Chandler takes the money, $2,400, and goes outside of Kirtland and buys a farm, brings his family in, lives there for the rest of his life. But Joseph made the statement that it would lead to both books, the book of Abraham and the book of Joseph.
Okay, so there is a manuscript, a papyrus of some sort that is separate. We know it's separate from the book of Abraham. In fact, I think that there's even an account, one of the accounts we'll go over here talks about two separate scrolls. The vignettes are apparently that are with the book of Joseph are part of the same scroll. And just like it is with the Abraham, right, where you've got the facsimiles that are, at least one of them, right, was part of the same papyrus, the same scroll. It's hard to say, I guess.
It is, because I think all of the mummies that Chandler had, of the 11 mummies that he acquired, I believe that they all had papyrus connected to them. Mm-hmm. Now, Chandler, the description that Chandler has, he had a chest of drawers drawers that were not very deep, that had multiple drawers, and he kept the papyrus flat inside of that chest. And it appears that most of the papyrus from the other mummies that never made it to Joseph Smith's hands were sold to Joseph Smith. I mean, the mummies, Joseph got 4 mummies. Of the 11 mummies, it appears that Chandler kept the papyrus from the other 11 in this chest, and Joseph, in the purchase, acquired not just the 4 mummies, but the papyrus from those 4 mummies, as well as papyrus from the mummies that Chandler had sold along the way. That's the way it comes across. Joseph.
So clarity here. So he also acquired the papyrus from each of the other 7 mummies that had been sold.
At least part of that.
At least part of that.
Yeah, at least it appears that Chandler kept the papyrus separate from the mummies that he was selling along the way in this chest of drawers. And the reason we think that is because Joseph said, when he had the papyrus, he said it covered the floor of the parlor of the mansion house.
Yeah.
Now we're looking at a 12 by 12 room, the parlor of the mansion house. And he said it would cover the whole floor of the parlor of the mansion house. Now, what the church has, the 11 fragments that the church has, would easily fit on the top of a normal desk.
Now, what fit on the floor, though? Wasn't that the book of Abraham?
No, he just said the papyrus that he had.
Oh, that he had.
Yeah.
Okay, so that could have been both then. Yeah.
Right, and it could have been more. That's why we think that it was probably more than just the 4 mummies that he acquired.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I know that John Gee had said that just with the book of Joseph, he figured that alone had to be at least 23 feet long by itself, but it could have been much more. Who knows? Yeah. So I did notice also in one of the statements, one of the references that we have to the book of Joseph, it had said that it's like there's a papyrus that's assigned to each mummy, right? It's like a book of the dead would be assigned to each mummy, because they're going to take that into the underworld, right? Into the afterlife with them, with the blessings. Basically, it's the blessings and direction and maybe map, etc., of what they're going to be going through in the underworld. And I don't know if we know, was it on their chest? Typically, it seems like it was, from the description, almost like they left it on their chest, maybe with their arms over it, or...
In part, some of them could have been on the chest. They could have been inside the sarcophagus, rolled up as rolls inside. Mm-hmm. Hypocephalus was generally separate because it would always go under the head of the mummy itself, and the head would rest on that. But the rolls of papyrus, they could be quite long. The Book of the Dead could be quite long, or the portions that they wanted buried with them or in the sarcophagi could be different lengths, but they could be rolled up and along the sides of the mummy itself within the sarcophagi.
Okay, so Chandler brings these to Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith purchases them. There's also an early emphasis, it seems, actually on the book of Joseph and not on the book of Abraham from the references, which makes sense, right? Because there's so much information, it seems, not so much, but there's so much more information than we have from Genesis in the Book of Mormon talking about Joseph, right? It's a very Josephite record. And so for that, perhaps there's a little more excitement about the writings of Joseph. Joseph Smith is told he's a direct descendant of Joseph. So maybe there's a little more emphasis on that, but it seems there's a little bit more excitement about this. But of course, he ends up going with the Book of Abraham first and preparing that for publication. And we never get any specific written document that we know of that has been translated, although it's obvious he did some translating, but we don't have any record of any of the translation that he's done, and certainly nothing that's been prepared for publication.
Right. I mean, when you talk about Genesis and the importance of Joseph, I mean, outside of the story of Rebecca being the longest chapter, there is probably more about Joseph in Genesis than any other patriarch or prophet in the book of Genesis. There's more about him. And I think there's a reason for that, is because he becomes the patriarch to all of the children of Israel. He is the patriarch, and the patriarchal narratives are focusing in on those patriarchs, be it from Adam to Seth to Enoch, right on down to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Joseph is the ending of those patriarchal narratives, and he is going to be the grand patriarch for the children of Israel for the rest of time, which translates into his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh.
Yeah.
And their blessing. And that's why they have to be gathered out even in the last days first. Ephraim and Manasseh have to be gathered first because Joseph is the patriarch to all of Israel. Reuben lost that birthright, and so it moves over to Joseph. That's why he gets the coat of many pieces, or the coat of many colors, it's the garment of the priest. It is people.
Yeah, I've got some questions about that for you actually at another time, but some thoughts that I have on that. But so, yeah, and also, in fact, I've heard Jewish scholars say, or read Jewish scholars who have said that, in a sense, the children of Israel had two different arks. They had the Ark of the Covenant, and they were carrying the bones of Joseph, and they were treated very similarly, right? It was like, this was like another ark, or at least a representation of Israel, right? You had the throne of God, and then you had kind of this representation of Israel that they carried around, which were the bones of Joseph.
It is. Not only are there traditions about the two arks, the bones of Joseph, which tradition has that they remained with Israel, and others are that he was buried north of Jerusalem there. But within the Jewish traditions, they have two Messiahs. They have Messiah ben Judah, which is Jesus Christ, and they have Messiah ben Joseph, which is Joseph that was sold into Egypt. And so even within these Jewish traditions, these two Messiahs are there. They're always in the background, Messiah ben Judah and Messiah ben Joseph. And it's interesting that John Taylor says in our Doctrine and Covenants that no one's done more for the salvation of man than Joseph Smith, except for Jesus Christ. So we even see these two Messiahs, this Messiah ben Judah, Jesus Christ, Messiah ben Joseph, the descendant of Joseph, as predicted and as prophesied in a record of Joseph that's in our Book of Mormon, because Joseph prophesies about his descendant in the last day, who's going to be named Joseph after him and after the name of his father, who will bring salvation to mankind. And so that's a direct connection back to Joseph, Messiah ben Joseph, and a direct connection back to Abraham and his. Yeah,
there's also, of course, before we get into some of this unveiling here, there's also the apocryphal book of Joseph and Aseneth. I'm not sure do you pronounce it Aseneth? How do you say it?
Aseneth is what
Aseneth. Okay, yeah, Aseneth. And which I actually really love this story, and I've really pulled a lot out of it. But there's a paper written by a man named, I think it's Gideon, I want to say Boak, and he writes something very, very interesting about this. But this is he ties it to a place called Leontopolis, which is in the nome of Heliopolis. And there is a temple built here in Leontopolis. It's actually a Jewish temple in Egypt that they had the permission. They've got the writings on this. They had the permission to build this temple. We know of the other one further south in Upper Egypt, down in on the island there,
Elephantine Island.
Yeah,
there.
yeah. But this was another one, right? That is in Lower Egypt, up in Heliopolis, and it's all about the priesthood. It's very interesting. It's about this honeycomb. There's a vision Asenath has about the honeycomb and these bees that have the colors of the high priests as they come out. Anyway, but there's just this tie. There seems like there's always this strain of Joseph that we don't really know about, we don't learn about, except we get pieces of this in scripture that's been restored, like in the Book of Mormon and in our tradition, and the things that we talk about in Gathering Israel, and of course the Joseph tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, and the focus on these that we have in Latter-day Saint scripture. All right, so with that, let's go into these slides that you have. If you want to go ahead, I'll add this in, and it should be right there. Okay. And why don't you go over some of this with us and tell us what we know about the book of Joseph?
Well, Joseph Smith began, when he began translating, he translated not only the book of Abraham as well as the book of Joseph. He had a manuscript for both translations. In preparation for publication, he would go through those manuscripts and prepare them to be public, or for the public, and to be published. And he did that in installments in the times and seasons. So we get 2 installments in the book of Abraham. And he never finished the last 3rd installment of the book of Abraham. And he didn't finish the book of Joseph in its preparation for publication. So the manuscripts were there and manuscripts existed. Now, with Oliver Cowdery, he starts to explain some of the papyrus to Oliver Cowdery, and in particular, one of the facsimiles that were contained in the book of Joseph, like there were facsimiles in the book of Abraham. Mm-hmm. And so that's the second picture here is a description, Joseph's description to Oliver Cowdery, and it's in the Messenger. It was in the Messenger and Advocate. This is Joseph's description of that facsimile, and he says, and Oliver's writing this, he says the inner end of the same roll. Now we're talking about this roll of papyrus. So he's talking about, you have the text and then you have this facsimile. And he says on the inner end of the same roll of Joseph's record presents a representation of the judgment. And that part's important because the judgment scene is very important in all books of the dead. At one view, you behold the Savior seated upon his throne. Now I put a number 1 there because the other facsimiles in Abraham are numbered, and so I just kind of numbered these for the sake of being able to see it later on. The Savior seated on his throne, crowned and holding the scepters of righteousness and power, before whom also are assembled the 12 tribes of Israel, representing the nations, the language, tongues of the earth, the kingdoms of the world over which Satan is represented as reigning. Then number 3, Michael the archangel, holding the key of the bottomless pit at the same time. Number 4, the devil as being chained up and shut up in the bottomless pit. But upon this last scene, I'm only able to give you a shadow of the real text. So this is what's published about. This is the explanation of the facsimile, one of the facsimiles in the book of Joseph. Okay, that Oliver Cowdery is giving us from Joseph Smith.
This is interesting. Real quick, I just intervene here. I know that in one of the statements, I want to say it's by Oliver Cowdery. Number 4 there, the devil as being chained and shut up in the bottomless pit. He gives a description. It says there's a description also, at least in one of some type of vignette within the scroll, of Michael holding the emblem of the bottomless pit, or the freedom from the bottomless pit.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting. Then you got that puts Michael against Lucifer, I guess, in a way there.
Which is always the case in all extra biblical literature. Michael is the one has the power. He's the one that casts him out of heaven in the pre-earth council. He's the one that controls him. He's the one in our Doctrine and Covenants that depicts Satan when he's appearing as an angel of light to Joseph Smith. He's the one that's arguing with Satan over the body of Moses. See, In the book of Revelations, Michael is the one that puts him into the bottomless pit, holding the key of the bottomless pit. So that's one of Michael's responsibilities, or Adam's responsibilities, in doing that. And so you have this description. This is a picture of the papyrus that the church has, of the 11 fragments. Now, it was torn in two down through the middle there, but when you put it back together, you get this judgment scene. In this picture, you have the dead person on the right. Now, I've gone through and I've put it on white paper so you can see it a little bit better, so that you can kind of see what's going on. In this case, you have the dead person on the right hand, on the right side, with the attendants and the escorts that are there. And then going on, you have the scale, which is down at the bottom. You have Thoth writing the judgment. You have the great devourer, the four sons of Horus, and Osiris on the left. You have and then you have the judges, the gods who set in judgment at the top, as is common in most scenes. Now, I turn this around just so we can look at it from left to right. I reverse it so you can look at it in left to right. And so on here, and I don't know whether you can see this or not, or will be able to see it, I've put the same numbers that I had in Oliver Cowdery's explanation on this facsimile so that you can see it. The Savior seated on his throne. Osiris is the one who was killed by his evil brother Seth, who's resurrected and then exalted, giving everyone that power to be exalted. The 12 tribes of Israel setting at the top, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, all nations, languages, and tongues of the earth. The statements down below are right out of the Times, or out of the Messenger and Advocate, so they're the exact statements. 3 is Michael. You can't see it very well. You can see his 2 feet at about the middle of the paper, 1 foot on one side, the other foot on the other side. That's generally represented as Thoth writing down the judgment. And then the devil is number 4 there. That's called the Great Devourer. He's part lion, part hyena. His face, his mouth, and head is alligator. Then his neck and shoulders are lion. His body is hyena, and his hindquarters are hippopotamus. He's everything you don't want to meet in Egypt after dark. And he consumes, if the judgment is not correct, he consumes the heart of the individual, which is being weighed on the scale, which is down below. Now, these are some just common pictures of the judgment scene, and you have all of the elements here. The same thing, the dead person on the left, the scale in the center, being checked by Anubis, so that mercy and justice, neither mercy nor justice, will be robbed. You have the heart of the individual on the left, which is his character, weighed against the character of God on the right, the Ma'at. You can see the Great Devourer there, the alligator, lion, hyena, and hippo, and Thoth is writing it down. That was in the centerpiece. And then the escort presenting the dead person to Osiris on the other side, with the god setting at the top. So this is a very common scene in almost all judgments or symposium scenes. Now, I've taken, on this particular one, I took the Joseph Smith Book of Joseph judgment scene at the top, and then Annie's from the papyrus of Annie is down at the bottom there. Mm-hmm. And Annie's is one of the most complete judgment scenes, and it's because Annie was a scribe, and so these cost money, and since Annie was a scribe, he did his own, and he did it more complete than any of them. Mm-hmm. And so I put I highlighted the same elements that we see in the Joseph facsimile with those in Annie. You can see all the same key elements that are there, so that a person can see what's going on there. Now, if you break it down, and I've taken the papyrus of Annie and broke it down here. So you have Annie, the dead person, in the upper left there. You have Annie and his wife there. You see Annie on the tomb. is sitting on a tomb with a bird body and his head, which represents his spirit. And his heart is in that jar. That's Ib, I-B. His heart is his character, and it's being weighed against Ma'at, the character of God, everything that's true and right and just and perfect. Thoth in the next, on the right-hand side, Thoth is writing the judgment down, and the great devourer, which in the explanation that Joseph gives represents Satan. The great devourer is waiting to eat the heart of Annie. Again, you can see his crocodile head and his lion's mane, his hyena spots, and his hippopotamus hindquarters. And then you have Horus, who is now escorting Annie. There's always an escort, even within our own scriptures, when a person, not just our scriptures, but in extra biblical texts too, when there's a vision or a manifestation or translation, there seems to always be an escort involved there, much like our temples. There's an escort to assist you.
Yeah.
And so Horus is the escort of Annie, holding his hand and has his arm up in the presentation scene, and the presentation talking to Osiris on the other side. And then on the bottom one, you see Horus there on the left there has his hand up, and he's presenting Annie to Osiris, which is on the far right. And this middle one is the in-between. This middle one is now, this middle part of this bottom vignette is Annie's in the presence of God, and he's making offerings to Osiris on the other side. If you were to see, this is actually in the British Museum. If you were to see this in the British Museum, it's in color. It's still in the original colors, and you will see Annie as Annie progresses through this, he gets whiter and whiter and whiter until his clothes are perfectly white, and even his hair is white by the time he reaches this last vignette.
Bruce, hold on. Let me see. I've got one of these. I want to see if that's the case on this one. I don't know if it is. I'm just going to change this to here. So I've got a little cylinder here. This is from Egypt when I was with you, and this is on actual papyrus. It is made locally there. And let's see if I can unroll this and have this show up properly. Well, that's not even going to, hold on. Let's see if I can fit this into the camera.
You can have to get way back.
I'm on the way. There we go. Okay. So I don't know. I can't see that very well. Is he getting whiter as he goes through?
Yeah. No, he doesn't on this one. His hair is white in the end one, but it's not true to the color in the British Museum, but it's very close. It's very close. But his hair is white in the end there.
Yeah. Okay.
But that is the copy from the papyrus of Annie. So this last vignette, this bottom vignette, becomes very important, and the important part of this is what's being said by the escort, by Horus on the left-hand side, and what he is saying is above his head and below his arm there, that's in the presentation mode of making a statement to Osiris on the other side. And so this is it up a little more up close. You have Annie here on the left, his heart being weighed in the balance against his character, weighed against the character of God. It's an interesting thing that Joseph Smith said, that we can't dwell with God until we have the character of God. Made a statement. You have the 12 who sat in judgment up at the top here. Going on to the next one, you have Thoth writing it down, the great devourer there, again, alligator, lion, hyena, and hippo. And then Horus making the presentation with Annie over on the right-hand side. And the important thing is what's being said here, the words that Horus is saying to Osiris on the other side of this, of his, we might call it a veil, but it's the separation between him and the rest of the world when Osiris, before Annie goes into the presence. But the important thing is what's being said. Now, I've got Budge's translation here on the left of what's there in front of Horus. I got Budge's translation, then my translation on the right, which is going to be easier to see. And this is what Horus is saying to Osiris on the other side. And it says in the hieroglyphics, "Thus saith Horus, the son of Isis, I have come unto thee, O great God, and have brought the resurrected Annie. His heart, or character, if you want to translate it that, his heart is pure and has come forth from the balance, and he has not sinned against any god or any goddess. Thoth hath waited according to the decree uttered by the council of the gods, those up above, of the gods unto him. It and his heart is true and very righteous. Grant that he may be given cakes and beer, and may he enter into the presence of Osiris and be like the followers of Horus forever, which is another form of exalted. So if you look at it, it's what the escort is saying to the god on the other side. What Horus is saying, look, he's done everything he's supposed to do according to the council of gods. He's done everything that he's supposed to do, and his heart is right and pure. He's not sinned against any god or any goddess. And then the request is, may he enter into the presence. In other words, he's been true and faithful. Now may he enter into the presence of Osiris and become like the followers of Horus forever. So it's a veil scene, what we might call a symposium scene, but it's connected to. There's been a number of brethren say that the things that were contained in the book of Joseph were of such a sacred nature that it shouldn't be published to the world, and this may be part of what Joseph restored in the book of Joseph. That may be because of the things that were in the book of Joseph, or revealed to Joseph Smith through the
which could be very sacred things about the temple.
Exactly. And Elder McConkie even went on to say that he felt that much of the endowment restored at Nauvoo was because of the things that were in the book of Joseph. So anyway, that just goes on. It's just that's basically all I have there.
So there is beer in the afterlife?
Well, even in Egypt, it says may he be given cakes or bread and beer. They didn't even drink the water back then, I guess. So.
Okay.
Anyway, so that's just part. I've got a lot of other information on this, but this is just a quick kind of review of the papyrus.
That's really cool. And so it's just interesting, right? That it's very similar to the Book of Abraham. You've got what we think is at least the Book of the Dead in there, some vignettes that go along with it. And then of course the question is, well, is there more, right? You're talking about this filled the floor of one of the rooms. And so was there much more that was used for translation, and all we have left are the fragments from the Book of the Dead portion on this? Or did Joseph Smith translate these things as, triggers from the vignettes and even the Book of the Dead, perhaps, and receive revelation through these things?
That's my opinion. I think it's more revelatory translation than just about anything else.
Yeah. I want to go over some of the references that have been made to the Book of Joseph historically, and just get your thoughts on these things. I've got 6 of them here, 6 references. As I said, John Gee suggests that one scroll, this would be the one of the Book of Joseph, could have been as long as 23 feet. Joseph Smith made multiple presentations in which he assumed very much a being familiar with the text of the Book of Joseph. So he seems to have gone through it, and if not having written it down through translation, he's familiar with this. He knows what this is. He's probably understood the entire, it seems like he's understood maybe the crux of what the Book of Joseph is talking about. Here's one of them from Joseph Smith. This is actually written by Willard Richards, but it's in the first voice of Joseph Smith as an entry. He says, with W.W. Phillips and Oliver Cowdery as scribes, this is Joseph Smith would be speaking, I commenced the translation of some of the characters or hieroglyphics, and much to our joy found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham, one of the rolls, another roll, the writings of Joseph of Egypt, a more full account of which will appear in its place as I proceed to examine or unfold them. Truly we can say the Lord is beginning to reveal the abundance of peace and truth. So this is in Joseph Smith's own words. There is a Book of Joseph by his own words. There is at least one scroll on the book of Joseph here. There's another account here by John Whitmer, who says, About the 1st of July, 1835, there came a man having 4 Egyptian mummies. This is Chandler, exhibiting them for curiosities, which is a wonder indeed, having also some words connected with them, which were found deposited with the mummies. But there being no one skilled in the Egyptian language, therefore could not translate the record. After this exhibition, Joseph the seer saw these records, and by the revelation of Jesus Christ, could translate these records, which gave an account of our forefathers. Much of which, interesting, he says that, our forefathers. Much of which was written by Joseph of Egypt, who was sold by his brethren, which when all translated will be pleasing history and great value to the saints. And this word history comes up over and over again in these references, to the point that one scholar recommends that the title of the book is The History of Joseph. It seems that they make this reference to the history of Joseph, not just in a description of what it is, but actually as a title, just which is kind of interesting.
I think too, from that quote there, he says that it was a revelation from Jesus Christ. Mm. If you notice in that
yes,
that it's a revelation from Jesus Christ about the which we're getting the translation from.
Yeah, exactly. It's a revelation. Here again is W.W. Phelps. The last of June, 4 Egyptian mummies were brought here. There were 2 papyrus rolls, he says, besides some other ancient Egyptian writings with them. That's interesting. So there's 2 papyrus rolls besides some other ancient Egyptian writings with them. Maybe Hypocephalus, who knows, or something. As no one could translate these writings, they were presented to President Smith. He soon knew what they were and said, the rolls of papyrus contained the sacred record of Joseph in Pharaoh's court in Egypt and the teachings of Father Abraham. God has so ordered it that these mummies and writings have been brought in the church, and the sacred writing I had just locked up in Brother Joseph's house when your letter came. So I had 2 consolations of good things in one day. These records of old times, when we translate and print them in a book, will make a good witness for the Book of Mormon. Again, this is, I think that primarily it seems to me like he's thinking of the Joseph stuff here. Right. There is nothing secret or hidden that shall not be revealed. Any comment on that?
No, I think it is. I think there's connections, especially not knowing what's in the book of Joseph exactly, but I wouldn't doubt that perhaps an explanation of the prophecies of Joseph that are recorded in the Book of Mormon may have been revealed to Joseph Smith through that record or through that translation.
So that letter was written to a woman named Sally, and in the same letter then written, I don't know who wrote it, but it's from Joseph Smith. He says, this is from W.W. Phelps. He says, Brother Joseph remarked that it was easy to shed tears while reading that letter. This is a letter from this woman, Sally. And it was as easy to shed tears while reading that letter as it was when reading the history of Joseph in Egypt. This is why one of the scholars says, no, he thinks the history is capitalized. And in fact, he says that, see if I've got this here. In several of the incidents where there is this is written, this description, so to speak, of history of Joseph, the H is actually capitalized along with Joseph in Egypt in the phrase history of Joseph in Egypt by those original, those original people that saw the record or were with Joseph at the time. The fourth is a reference from a convert named Albert Brown. He had recently arrived in Kirtland, and he says, I will relate one incident that happened not long since in our favor by some men that had 4 Egyptian mummies, which they were carrying through the world to exhibit, and also an ancient record that was found in their coffins. This record contained some of the history of Joseph while in Egypt, and also of Jacob, and many prophecies delivered by them. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So he mentions Jacob in there, if that's true, that, maybe Joseph, like Nephi does with Lehi, maybe Joseph had included some of Joseph or Jacob's prophecies as well in there. And then we get this really long one. And this is the longest one we get, which is from Oliver Cowdery. And I think you had some of this in your description there, but I'm going to go ahead and read it anyway.
Yeah.
It says, the language in which this record is written is very comprehensive, and many of the hieroglyphics exceedingly striking. The evidence is apparent upon the face that they were written by persons acquainted with the history of the creation, the fall of man, and more or less of the correct ideas of notions of the deity. The representation of the Godhead, three, yet in one, is curiously drawn to give simply, though impressively, the writer's views of the exalted personage. The serpent represented as walking. Now, there's a vignette that we have on one of the fragments that has a walking serpent in front of one of the women, a woman.
Right.
And he is saying that it looks like it's, from the Garden of Eden, or formed in a manner to be able to walk standing in front of and near a female figure, is to me one of the greatest representations I have ever seen upon paper or a writing substance. And he says this, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I looked this up. He says, Enoch's pillar, as mentioned by Josephus, is upon the same roll. You know about Enoch's pillar?
Yeah, Josephus does talk about it in his record. And there is in the papyrus, there is a pillar, kind of a triangle. It's not triangle, but it's sloped sides with a staff on the top of it.
Yeah, there's that. The other one though is I have seen some people use the representation. Apparently, there's two pillars. One that's supposed to be made of brick. One that's supposed to be made of stone. And because apparently Adam originally had said that there was the earth would be destroyed by water. And that would not be good with a brick, and it would be destroyed by fire. Somehow that's not going to be good by the stone. And so they wanted both that could withstand both catastrophes.
Right.
But one of them, based on Josephus's writings, was written by the descendants of Seth, and the other one was written by the Egyptians. And that these were the pillars. And so a lot of people make the connection that it was a pyramid. And there is actually an upside down pyramid on one of the vignettes in the papyrus there with the Book of the Dead, which is the Book of Joseph, part of the Book of Joseph scroll. So that's kind of, I had never seen that before. So that was kind of interesting. At the inner end of the same roll of Joseph's record presents a representation of the judgment, which is what you had shown. Mm-hmm. At one view, you behold the Savior seated upon his throne, crowned and holding the scepters of righteousness and power, before whom also are assembled the 12 tribes of Israel, the nations, languages, and tongues of the earth, the kings of the world, over which Satan is represented as reigning. Michael the archangel holding the key of the bottomless pit, and at the same time the devil as being chained and shut up in the bottomless pit. So that's kind of interesting. You've got kind of what you were saying there about that. Not much more on this, but it does say at the very end here, he's judging from their size and the comprehensiveness of the language. One might reasonably expect to see a sufficient to develop much upon the mighty acts of the ancient men of God and of his dealing with the children of men when they saw him face to face. So this is not a small piece that he's looking at. Right. Again, there's much, much, much more than what we have here. It seems over and over again, as one scholar here had commented, Quentin Barney, that there is a clear temple theme, similar to the Book of Abraham, maybe more descriptive, right, with the vignettes, all the vignettes, and with the descriptions here. And like you said, I mean, maybe that's the reason that it can't be published. And now, Bruce R. McConkie did say, another comment from Bruce R. McConkie was, the day shall come when the book of Joseph shall be restored and its contents shall be known again.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, both Sidney B. Sperry and Elder James Talmage kind of said the same thing that McConkie did, in that it contained things of such a sacred nature that it shouldn't be published. So that was their feeling towards the things in the book of Joseph. So,
yeah, it always is. I always, and obviously, I'm going to subject myself to the will of the Lord on these things, but I always feel a frustration. It's like, why? I wish we had this. How much more knowledge would we have about these things? How much more testimony and faith building would this be if we had this? But all things in their due time, I suppose.
Well, the question is, you're not going to get more until you read and understand what you already have.
Yes.
And so maybe it's a protection to not get certain things that are of such a sacred nature. If we don't take the scriptures seriously now, what makes you think we'll take something more sacred seriously?
Yeah. That judgment scene is now blaring in my head here, thinking about that. So,
yeah.
Well, this is awesome. This is great stuff. Again, I think that a lot of people don't realize that there is a book of Joseph. You know what? Let's finalize this with the story of, I think, Parley P. Pratt and Joseph F. Smith, and kind of about when this happened and what we know about this, which might pertain to the book of Joseph.
I was working for the Religious Studies Center at BYU, which really focuses on scripture, on scriptural research. And I had worked for the Old Testament, I don't know what you want to call it, department of the Religious Studies Center. And I was working for the Pearl of Great Price department of the Religious Studies Center. And at that particular time, Donnell Peterson, Donnell Peterson, was the director of the Pearl of Great Price department of the Religious Studies Center. And so I was working with him, and we were given the assignment to actually try and find the will of Antonio Leibelo, because Michael Chandler, when he comes to Joseph Smith in 1835, says that he was the nephew of Leibelo, and that Leibelo willed, before he died in Trieste, that he willed all of the mummies and papyrus to him. And so I was asked, we were asked, the Religious Studies Center, Pearl of Great Price department, was asked to try and do the research surrounding that will. And eventually we were sent over to Europe. Donnell and myself, Brother Peterson and myself, were sent over to Europe, the Mediterranean area, Italy, and into the Middle East, into Egypt, to do research and continue the research. We went into Ireland to do research on Chandler, where he was from. And we were gone for almost 8 months in that time. I had gone back to New York and Philadelphia 2 summers to do research prior to that, in preparation for that. But in doing that, in looking at that research, we were tasked with to try and find the will of Leibelo, which we did find the will of Leibelo. They had been looking for it for 150 years, but they were just looking in the wrong place and under the wrong name. But we did find the will of Leibelo, showing that there was no connection to Michael Chandler, that he was just telling a story. So.
Yeah, he was using shenanigans.
He was, but in the 1870s, Elder Pratt and Elder Smith were given the assignment to go back to Nauvoo, where Emma was still alive and living, and Brother Peterson and I, we had asked for permission to see the minutes of the First Presidency when they set Elder Pratt and Elder Smith apart. Now, he'd done it before, and this time under assignment, we were basically given a lot of access to what's now called the Joseph Smith papers and things like that we hadn't been before. And so looking at the minutes, we were given permission to look at the minutes of the First Presidency when they set him apart. And they specifically set him apart, Pratt and Smith, to go back. They sent Joseph F. Smith back there because he was the nephew of Lucy. And so they were set apart to do basically 3 things. One is to purchase the rest of the Book of Abraham manuscript, that last third. And to purchase, the second thing was to purchase the Book of Joseph manuscript. And the third thing was to invite Emma to come west with him, to come back with him. And it was called a mission to the States, and you can look it up. It was a mission to the States, just going back to Nauvoo and back again. They weren't gone very long, but they both returned. They returned together about 2 or 3 days before October conference. And we had, as any good researcher would do, we asked to see the minutes of the First Presidency when they returned and reported. We saw the setting apart and what they were set apart to do, specifically to do, but they wouldn't allow us to see the minutes of the return and report part. But they both spoke in conference, that October conference when they got back. And they both said that we had a very successful mission, but Emma didn't come. She didn't come back with him, which to have a successful mission would imply that they were able to acquire the manuscripts from her that she kept of the rest of the Book of Abraham and the Book of Joseph. Now, that may be why Sperry and Elder Talmage and Elder McConkie said what they said, because they may have reviewed that manuscript. And I don't know for sure, and I can't say that they have or that the church has it. We never got that far, but I do know why they were set apart and went back to Nauvoo. And they did say that they both said that they had a very successful mission. So it could be that the manuscript's somewhere.
Yeah. Well, they're somewhere. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's very, very intriguing. And you know, I think your point is well taken, that we as members of the church need to prepare ourselves more to be able to receive more. And there is more. And not just the Book of Joseph, which is yet to be revealed to us, although we're doing what we can here a little bit on the fringes of this. But but there's probably much, much more. There's the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon. There's other records from John. There's so much more that we could have if we just adopted what we already have and understood it more and prepared ourselves more. And I hope we're going in that direction. I hope we're moving toward the direction of actually being able to receive more. And I'm not sure we are.
There's a great verse in the Doctrine and the Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, says, "You will receive that which you're willing to receive, because you would not receive that which you might have received."
Yeah.
So we hope we're preparing for more.
Yeah, I hope we get past those might haves. So, yeah. Bruce, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Awesome information, very exciting stuff. And like you said, we'll see you in Egypt.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Greg. We appreciate it.
All righty.